In the late afternoon of June 30th, 2018, the Daniel K. Inouye was officially launched from its shipyard in Philadelphia. This was the first in a line of 5 highly advanced Aloha-class container vessels commissioned for the Matson Shipping Company. Capable of carrying the equivalent of 3,220 20-foot shipping containers, they are each going to be tied for the largest merchant ships ever produced by the USA. These ships have become the pride of the Philly shipyard that will be producing them, and they would be an incredibly impressive achievement, except for the fact that on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, shipyards like Hanwha Ocean in South Korea were building vessels 5 times as large. Oh, and in the same time it's taken the Philadelphia shipyard to build just 2 of these vessels, the Korean yards have built more than 50 of a new class of mega freighters that now dominate global trade routes. Oh yeah, and one more thing. The American shipyard isn't even American anymore. It was purchased by the same South Korean company they were competing with just over a year ago. In the race to move the world's ocean trade, the war has more or less been won by just 3 countries: Japan, China, and South Korea. What makes this so interesting is that by all accounts there is no physical reason why they should have won. Now, if you were to ask the average person how these 3 countries came to dominate modern shipbuilding, they're probably going to say something about labor being cheaper in a country like China. After all, ships are clearly one of the easiest manufactured goods to, well, ship around the world, so it would only make sense to go where the workers are cheapest, right? Well, in this case, it doesn't really matter. Labor is only a very tiny component of the cost of building a ship. According to an industry analysis conducted by the OECD, an ultra-large container ship built in a yard like Samsung Heavy Industries typically sells for around $150 to $200 million, depending on exact specifications. From that end price, only around $10 million will go to paying the actual yard workers who put these vessels together. In addition, most of the work is done by massive machinery, and the technicians that operate these yards are paid very well, even by European and American standards. The real costs are almost entirely in the mechanical components, the sheer volume of steel, and the time that these vessels spend sitting in the yard. In many cases, these input costs are actually more expensive in China, Japan, and South Korea than they would be elsewhere. Shipyards in these 3 countries didn't win because they were cheaper, they won because they were better. So then, if shipbuilding is so important, why aren't other countries even trying to do the same thing that these 3 are doing? Well, there are really 2 parts to this story. The first is how the shipbuilding titans of the past lost their dominating lead, and the second is how the new Asian upstarts stole away this critically strategic industry. At the end of the 19th century, there was just one country that dominated shipbuilding: the United Kingdom. The colonial empire at the time gave them both the resources and the motivation to build the largest naval and merchant fleets the world had ever seen up until that point. Other European empires slowly started to catch up as they wanted their own presence in the world's oceans, particularly as it became clear that they were all gearing up for a great war. After we got that all squared away, the UK and the rest of Europe continued to dominate shipbuilding. Trade and transport between North America was becoming an increasingly lucrative endeavor, which kicked off a merchant building spree. On the naval side, interwar militaries were still suspicious of rivalries and resentments that weren't exactly settled by the First World War, and they were already gearing up for the sequel. During this time, these nations actually agreed to limit the size of the biggest ships in their navies through the Washington and London naval treaties. These agreements set guidelines on how big capital naval ships could be and how many each country was allowed to have. The hope was that this would avoid a costly arms race. Now, as you can probably guess, with the benefit of hindsight, this didn't really work, and one of the simplest loopholes was just to build a larger number of smaller ships that weren't defined by these rules. But by the Second World War, it didn't really matter anyway. For the next 5 years, global shipbuilding would be dominated by one country and one country only: the USA. Between 1941 and 1945, the Yanks built more ships than every other country on the planet combined 6 times over. American yards were launching a new ship every single day, and they were using them to supply the war effort in Europe and fight their own battles in the Pacific. But this created a bit of a problem: massive oversupply. You see, most of the ships built during the war were not the attention-grabbing battleships or aircraft carriers, but rather supply vessels to carry provisions across the oceans and feed the front lines. The American logistics machine was so massive that they even deployed specialty refrigeration ships to the Pacific Theater with the express mission of making ice cream for troops fighting in the tropical heat. As the legend goes, a Japanese general who was struggling to feed his starving forces at the time eventually found out that the Americans had enough resources to waste on these ice cream ships, and it was at that point he knew the war was truly over. Either way, after the war, American shipbuilding effectively stopped overnight, which didn't actually make that much sense. Sure, they didn't need to keep such a large navy anymore, but international trade was starting to boom. The Bretton Woods global financial system locked in currency exchange rates, which made doing business across borders far more easy, as every major government agreed to keep their own currency locked in line with the USD. This, combined with a post-war recovery, was really opening up global trade at this time, but American shipping companies had a choice to make. They could buy one of the thousands of Liberty ships the US Navy was dumping on the market, or they could commission a new ship for 10 times the price. Unsurprisingly, US shipyards didn't have many customers lining up, so most of them just closed down. On the other side of the Pacific, though, the story was completely different. To support their war effort, Japan had developed the skills to build some of the world's most impressive ships, and after the war was over, the American occupation actually encouraged them to keep on working on their shipping industry. The Americans really wanted to hold off the spread of communism into Asia, and they saw Japan as a strategic outpost to control that objective. By encouraging the shipping industry, the Americans not only opened up a new trading partner, they also created good jobs for lots of workers who in turn wouldn't be tempted by silly ideas like seizing the means of production. Japanese shipyards also got another lifeline in 1950 from yet another war, this time on the Korean Peninsula. UN forces were primarily coming all the way from the USA and Europe to fight against the North Koreans and Chinese, who were right there with direct access to the front lines. Instead of sailing their combat and logistics ships all the way back across the world for repairs and maintenance, they instead opted to use the shipyards right next door in Japan. In a strange twist of fate, these were the exact same shipyards that were fighting against these navies less than half a decade before. But historic ironies aside, the injection of capital gave these Japanese yards what they needed to start the positive feedback loop. Japan, alongside China and South Korea, are severely lacking in the raw materials they need to make ships, like the iron ore that's used to make steel, which is used to make hulls. As the Japanese got better at building massive bulk freighters, they lowered global shipping rates, which made it easier for them to import raw materials from places like Australia and Brazil, which made it cheaper for them to build even more ships. By the 1970s, Japan was building more ships than every other country in the world combined. Europe had shifted to specifically built cruise liners, the UK had given up, and the US just wasn't even playing the same game. At this point, you'll have probably noticed that a lot of shipbuilding depends on who's going to war with who. Well, the USA figured this out way back in 1920 when they passed the Jones Act. This law effectively says that for a ship to operate between two American ports, it needs to be built in America, flagged in America, and operated by Americans. When they first passed this law, the intention of it was that it would encourage and protect local shipping and shipbuilding industries, which meant that if they ever went to war, they would have a strong naval capability at home. Unfortunately, these noble ambitions were no match for simple, practical economics. Since American shipbuilders had guaranteed customers from the US Navy and domestic merchants like Matson from the beginning of this video, they never really needed to compete with other global shipyards. This meant they stayed small, specialized, and far less efficient than the new conglomerates growing in Asia. But it wasn't cost alone that let Japan go on to dominate global shipbuilding. Their real secret weapon was finance. By this time, Japan had become an export powerhouse, selling everything from TVs to Toyotas all over the world. But when people paid for these exports, they were mostly doing it in their own foreign currency. An American dollar may be the greatest piece of paper ever created by man, but it's not going to buy you much in Japan. So these growing export companies exchanged it for local yen, which they could use to run their business. Now, this was a problem because every time they traded American dollars for Japanese yen, it would push up the price of the yen, which was not allowed. The Bretton Woods system, which Japan had agreed to all the way back in 1952, stipulated that they fix their exchange rate at 360 yen to 1 American dollar. So to counteract the market activity of Japanese companies selling American dollars to buy Japanese yen, the Japanese government had to sell Japanese yen to buy American dollars, which presented them with a strange problem. They had too many American dollars. Instead of just piling all of this into bonds and collecting interest on this cash, the Japanese government had a better idea, and they formed a series of public banks. One of these banks was the rather creatively named Export-Import Bank of Japan, and the primary objective given to this bank by the government was to administer low-cost loans to support the corporate growth of strategic export companies. So how did this actually work? Say you were a 1970s international businessman and you wanted to start your own shipping empire. Well, you're going to need some ships. If you go to the European yards, you are going to have to pay for your ships up front in cash before they even lay down the keel. If you don't have that much money on hand, you could take out a loan from a regular bank, but they're going to want a significant down payment and proof that you have enough money left over to pay them back even if the ship never makes it into the ocean. However, if you go over and talk to the yards in Japan, the government-run Import-Export Bank will be there to help you out. What they do is take some of the American dollars they had stockpiled and send it to your preferred private bank of choice. That deposit could be a down payment on a ship from a Japanese yard, which means you purchase your first vessel with much less money down. To make the deal even sweeter, the Import-Export Bank of Japan would also offer refund guarantees on ships built in their country. If you pay for a ship and then the shipbuilder goes out of business before delivering your vessel, then you are, as people in the industry would say, ship out of luck.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But seriously though, even if the chance of a shipyard going out of business is incredibly low, there is so much money on the line that most normal banks won't finance a project unless the buyer has enough money in reserve, or they can get a refund guarantee from the government through an institution like the Import-Export Bank of Japan. In 1999, the Import-Export Bank of Japan was merged with the Japanese Overseas Economic Cooperation Fund to form the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, but its day-to-day mission remains the same. On their website, in addition to providing upfront financing for ships, they also offer financial services on satellites, ports, railways, and nuclear generators. Today, this has almost become the industry's standard, which goes a long way to narrowing down which countries can reasonably offer such high-priced exports. For a country to sell ships, it needs a government bank willing to underwrite them. To get a government bank willing to underwrite them, they need a lot of foreign exchange reserves. And to get a lot of foreign exchange reserves, they need to be a major export power to begin with. When you also add on the requirement that these countries need to have access to the ocean, they need to have governments stable enough to not just squander these foreign exchange reserves and have the industrial capacity to build ships. It's not that surprising that only 3 countries can tick all of these boxes today, and it's also not surprising that they're all here right next to each other. But that still doesn't answer the whole question. A country like Germany, for example, still technically ticks all these boxes, so why haven't they got a multi-billion-dollar ship industry as well? Well, they actually do, and netted out, they make just as much money from shipbuilding as the South Koreans. The only difference is they just focus on the parts of the ship that actually make money. Companies like MAN Diesel and Turbo, MTU, and Caterpillar build marine engines that cost up to 50 million euros each. That's almost a quarter of the final build cost of these mega freighters in a machine that took only a tiny fraction of the raw materials. Perhaps the clearest example of this lies in this unassuming factory here. This is MMG, and all they do is make the propellers that end up going on these ships. Each of the screws that go on to power the ultra-large container ships coming out of the yards over in Asia ultimately start their journey back here in Germany. About 110 tons of copper, aluminium, nickel, and magnesium are melted down to form a bronze alloy resistant to saltwater corrosion and the immense forces it will be dealing with over its lifetime. Those materials at today's market prices would cost MMG about 1.2 million euros, but once their highly skilled technicians and state-of-the-art machines shape that slab of metal into a propeller, they can sell them to the shipyards for more than 3 million euros each. That's a markup of over 100%, even after including labor and, well, shipping. Compare that to the shipyards themselves. The sheer scale of their operations is impressive, but most of their work is turning steel sheets into glorified floating boxes that'll be packed full of other boxes. According to available financials, about 80% of the value of the finished container ship comes from the component parts themselves. After accounting for the 10% that goes to the yard workers, that only leaves 10% for the yards themselves to cover all their overheads and turn a profit. The margins are razor thin, but that's actually both a blessing and a curse. And that's because there's one final box that these countries need to tick to have a domestic shipbuilding industry, and it's an important one. They have to actually want a shipbuilding industry. Of course, these shipyards would love to juice their profit margins, but by keeping the income statement so tight, it makes it incredibly difficult for any other competitors to enter the business or even want to enter the business. The fact that the industry has become so consolidated has let them fill order books decades in advance and build multiples of the same class of ships over and over again, cutting down on design costs and giving them a competitive moat of sheer economies of scale. For everybody else, it's just easier to buy from these three. Yes, the ability to build ships is clearly a strategic military advantage, but to use Germany as an example again, their naval fleet is quite small and is meant to complement NATO operations rather than project power across the planet like the USA. Additionally, not to go full armchair general, but if a global conflict broke out which made it impossible to procure merchant ships from these Asian yards, we wouldn't be able to sail those container ships around anyway. In America, strategic shipbuilding still exists, but there's really only one client worth working for, the Department of Defense. If you take a look at that shipyard in Philadelphia from the beginning of the video, slowly constructing small Jones Act compliant merchant ships, you won't need to walk around long to see where the real money is made. A single Gerald R. Ford class aircraft carrier is purchased by the Navy at a unit price of $13 billion. So even though they're only slightly smaller overall than a container ship like the CMA Champs-Élysées, they are worth 65 times more. They also present far more lucrative ongoing contracts for maintenance programs with no global competition, because obviously the US Navy isn't going to let a dry dock in China do repair work on a carrier's nuclear reactors. Within the last 5 years, yards in China, Japan, and South Korea have produced the largest container ships the world has ever seen, but all of those ships combined are still only worth as much as one of these freedom exporting capital ships. In Europe, the decision was similar. We are still building ships, just at a far lower volume and far higher quality. We have our own navies, and we even export highly technical craft like submarines, but we also have businesses like Lausanne, Aberking and Rasmussen, Benetti and Fedship, which build super yachts where price is much less of a factor. When Jeff Bezos commissioned his midlife crisis Kourou, it was built by Ocean Co. in the Netherlands. At only 127 meters long, it was less than a 50th the overall size of the new ultra-large container ships. But it cost more than twice as much because it was a highly technical design paid for by someone who could be much more cavalier with their wallet. By pure volume alone, the three Asian giants dominate global shipbuilding to a point where everybody else barely shows up in the data. But in terms of the real value of the industry, it's a collaborative and highly interdependent endeavor. They've gone into the mass market, high volume, low margin. Then the McDonald's of global shipbuilding, a good business, but just different from the fine dining everybody else has decided to specialize in. And well, just like McDonald's, these yards do not exactly have the most promising future at the moment. Go and watch this video next to find out why these mega freighters don't really end up making any money for the shipping companies that buy them.